Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. It was a transformative time. He, a remarkable president. It was a turbulent and eccentric era, the time of P.T. Barnum and of Melville, Hawthorne, Emerson, and Whitman, of Doctrines Monroe and Tyler, of crashes and clashes. He was the great democratizer, the catalyst of the two-party system, and a brawler, a racist, an agent of genocide. He was Andrew Jackson, the time, America, 1815 to 1848. To talk about Andrew Jackson and his time and the parallels to our time is David Reynolds, Distinguished Professor of English and American Studies at the Graduate Center here at CUNY. He has recently published Waking Giant, America in the Age of Jackson, a magnificent biography of our seventh president and a rich intellectual and social history of the United States from the end of the War of 1812 to the end of the Mexican War. David is also author of the prize-winning John Brown Abolitionist and Walt Whitman's America and Beneath the American Renaissance, as well as other books and many articles. He's a regular reviewer for the New York Times Book Review. He is now at work on a book on Harriet Beecher Stowe. Welcome, David.
Great to be here, Doug.
Great read. Two questions. Why this era and why biography? But it's not really biography. It's really cultural and intellectual history.
Well, for me, biography and cultural history intersect because I think each of us is really a product of our time, of our moment. And so many images, even in our subconscious mind, come from the images that are swirling around us in the culture. So
sure.
To me, that's the way I treat John Brown, that's the way I treat Walt Whitman, that's the way I treat Andrew Jackson and so forth. So to me, I try to explore that intersection between the individual and the larger society, and that's basically what I do in this book.
Why this era? I mean, the John Brown book, the Whitman book, this book, and the Stowe book basically is from 1815 to 1860, that about 45-year period. Why this era?
Well, what got me fascinated in this era to begin with was that it was the richest cultural era in American history. You had Emerson, Thoreau, Poe, Hawthorne, Melville, Walt Whitman, a little bit later at the end of the period, Emily Dickinson, all of these people and some great artists, Asher B. Durand, Thomas Cole, the whole Hudson River School, which some people say defines American art. You had the rise of popular culture with P.T. Barnum, the rise of the penny newspapers and the tabloids, and it was just such an explosive period, wonderful period.
Do you get out of it? I mean, do you have any plans on getting out of this period, or is it so rich?
I sometimes feel trapped in it, but I love being trapped in it. I love exploring it. Now I'm doing a book on Harriet Beecher Stowe and haven't started writing it, but I'm still in the research phase of it. So I don't mind being in it. I love the period so much. I would like to maybe get into the 20th century a little bit, but that's kind of, I will do one thing at a time. And
right,
so,
that 20th century is 40 years in the future.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Talking about Jackson, there are 3 books out on Jackson: Waking Giant, John Meacham's American Lion, and Robert Remini's Andrew Jackson, which was also previously published. What is it about Jackson at this moment, or the time at this moment?
I truly think that Americans want change, and I think for several years Americans have wanted change. Political change, and even to some degree, kind of a new direction in society and so forth. And I think that Andrew Jackson, above all, was a figure of change, of reform, of departing from the old ways. He was the first truly democratic president, the one that represented the people the first. He was the first one that wasn't part of the Virginia dynasty or the New England Federalist dynasty.
Right.
The first one that was born in a log cabin.
He was poor.
He was poor. The first one from what was then the West, which was Tennessee. So, and I think that in a way kind of slips nicely into the whole Obama revolution and all of that, and which in a sense begins several years ago when people get a little tired of the whole Bush thing and are kind of looking to the future.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk about those parallels. Also, these three works really fill in, and other works fill in the period between the Founding Fathers and Lincoln. We've got a whole rash of books about the Founding Fathers and Founding Brothers, and then we've got a continuing avalanche of books about Lincoln. And these books sort of fit in between that period, those two eras.
There's a renewed interest in that whole interregnum, so to speak, that period between the Founding Fathers and the Civil War. And people are looking back to that more and more now and recognizing just how important, how crucial that period was as a transition between the founding of the nation and the abolition of slavery through the Civil War.
Okay, now, you described this period as one of the most turbulent and exciting periods. One of the things that you focus on in the book, and that I found the most fascinating, were the outliers, as you call them, the philosophers, the writers, the showmen, the cult leaders, the purveyors of panaceas. You have the mesmerists, the transcendental. Talk about, you know, as I described it earlier, as sort of the wackiness of the era.
Yeah, well, you had, what happened is that after the separation of church and state occurred after the American Revolution, you in a sense had a new freedom of expression, both in religion, in philosophy, in reform movements, and therefore you had a lot of these outliers, people that were very experimental, they were optimistic, and you had an explosion of revivalism, religious revivalism, and certain people would go to these revivals and actually think that they not only experienced God, but in a sense became God themselves. And so they became cult leaders, and they had followers. They would go around the countryside. They had immense followings, and a lot of them had many wives. This was the period when Mormonism arose. Joseph Smith had gone to a revival. He thought he saw angels that gave him the Golden Books of Mormon that he translated, and that began the whole Mormon church. So just an incredible time of creative expression, often associated with religion or reform. And also fads such as mesmerism, in which people would get on stage and could talk in many different languages and see distant countries and distant
time travel.
And time traveling. That's right, time traveling. And the audiences really believed this. And spiritualist seances in which tables were being lifted and ghostly hands came in and so forth. It was amazing, Yeah, and
then you could tell people's character and intelligence by feeling the bumps on their, the phrenology.
Yeah, phrenology. They believed that by feeling the bumps on one's skull, they could read your character and, in a way, tell your destiny and also warn you that you should work on these certain characteristics that were too big as bumps, and you should try to suppress them or exaggerate them.
Social movements, though, come out of the serious social movements that have a profound effect. I mean, but they're interrelated. Is what you do is point out the causal connections between the sort of the wackiness and the real substantive movements for change, like abolitionism, like women's rights, like temperance, for example. Talk about those movements and the nexus among those movements and how this is all of a piece.
Yeah, to me, among the outliers, there were some crazy people, but also there were some people that really were forward-thinking, were thinking to the future, and a lot of the abolitionists who really wanted to get rid of slavery, starting with William Lloyd Garrison and going through Elijah Lovejoy and John Brown and Harry Beecher Stowe and so forth. These were figures who really were, in a sense, outliers, and yet themselves foresaw social change, very important social change, in the way that people like Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, and the whole civil rights movement foresaw the kind of social change that would come later on in our era. So for me, the reformers, of course it takes both reform and politicians, but the reformers were often the ones who looked forward and then the politicians often followed a little bit later on.
Yeah, I mean, let's bring this to the current day almost,
Yeah.
or almost the current day.
Yeah.
There was that discussion in the primary season between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, where Barack Obama points to Martin Luther King as the social reformer that leads to these changes in American society and law. And Clinton responds by saying, wait a minute, it's the politician, it's Lyndon Johnson, who actually gets the legislation through. So is that a legitimate parallel to what you're...
It is. I think that the reformers are always necessary to look ahead, but I agree that ultimately, I mean, it's not until you get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, until you get the actual laws in place, that it becomes really meaningful on a wide scale. So I think both have to occur. On that particular conflict, I think I would side with Obama, saying that it really takes that prophecy by the reformers, by the outliers, that prophecy and that boldness up front to kind of pave the way for social change. That's my opinion.
And then also, I mean, between this book and the John Brown book, you see sort of the evolution of movements from more intellectual to much more actively engaged due to frustration, whatever, until you had the explosion with Brown first, I guess, in Kansas, and then in Harper's Ferry.
Yeah, I mean, most of the early abolitionists, they hated slavery, but they were also pacifists. And John Brown came a little later, and he was more of a more given to violence. And he foresees the Civil War, which was a lot of violence, obviously. Sure. So it did take bloodletting, national bloodletting, to get rid of slavery. And John Brown ultimately saw that. But the earlier abolitionists were pacifist, non-resistance, a little more like Martin Luther King. But that itself is very, very important as well, extremely important. So you cannot discount the early ones just to praise someone like John Brown or the later ones.
Okay, but at the same time with these abolitionists, they held rather, from our point of view, rather regressive views of race.
Well, quite often.
And of the Negro.
Yeah, quite often that was true. I would say the abolitionists in general were closer to being non-racist than obviously figures like Andrew Jackson or many of the presidents, because so many of the presidents were slaveholders themselves.
I mean, I think you give a number, 12 out of the first 14 presidents are slaveholders?
12 either owned slaves while they were in office or had owned slaves previously. So...
And two Supreme Court justices.
Yeah, two Supreme
John Marshall and Taney.
And Taney. And then for 50 of the first 64 years of the presidency, the executive office was, inhabited by a slaveholder. So you had so many slaveholders in office, including Andrew Jackson and George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, on and on and on. These early presidents who were slaves. So that's how far we've come today. Wow. With Obama representing, obviously, just the ultimate goal of getting an African American in office.
Okay, let me jump ahead. I mean, talking about parallels to the current day, on October 31st, you had a post in the Huffington Post called "The Race Factor: How Far We've Come." Talk about that. Give us your sense of how far we have come and how far we need to go, and will we do it?
Well, I just mentioned all the presidents who owned slaves. They also had racial views that were unfortunate and very backward from our perspective. And not only that, but after the Civil War, yes, we did get rid of slavery, but we had years of Jim Crow, we had segregation, we had lynching and all kinds of unfortunate occurrences, racial prejudice. And then it wasn't really until the 50s and 60s that the Civil Rights Movement got rid of that, or at least diminished that to some degree, at least. And so how far we've come today to elect an African-American president is just incredible.
Let's switch a moment to Jackson and politics. As I noted in the intro, Jackson was the catalyst of the two-party system.
Yes.
And in a sense, helped create the second-party system.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that, and let's move then to the current day. Are we potentially in another inflection point here where the 2008 election may signal a realignment that sort of occurred in the 1928 or 24-28 election?
Yeah, I think so. I think that Jackson ran on the whole idea of reform and of change. and he did change the nature of the American presidency. I think that in some ways he changed it for the good. In other ways, for example, he chose a lot of his cronies, his friend, for his first cabinet, and that led to certain problems. I think that Obama is taking a little better course. It is true that maybe some people would complain he's choosing Clintonites and so forth.
But who's he going to choose in a Democratic administration? The last Democratic president was Carter.
I know, yeah, exactly. So I think that Obama is showing, at the very least, a good pragmatism and not necessarily going after cronies, friends that are close to him. So I think that's a very positive and good thing about, we can't foresee the future, but we can hope that itself is not just, unfortunately, Jackson did kind of surround himself with people that were called the kitchen cabinet. These were friends of his that kind of governed a lot of the policy. And, hopefully we won't get that.
Yeah, and also, Andrew Jackson could not become president today.
No.
I mean, he's, his personal behavior, he's a dualist. He's a.
Yes.
I mean, talk about Jackson, the man, for a second. Tell us who this guy is.
He's a very bold man. He said he never felt the emotion of fear once in his life. He was in 3 duels. He got in all kinds of street fights. He had 2 bullets in his body. He just incredible in that sense.
His love life is questionable.
Yeah, he lived for 2 years with a woman that he thought that she was divorced, and she thought so too, but she wasn't. So he came under charges of adultery and all of that. Today he would have a lot of difficulty becoming president, because even though he'd be popular, it was rumored that he had only read one other book than the Bible, and that was a novel called The Vicar of Wakefield, and he had gone through law school without reading a book, supposedly, allegedly. So, as opposed to someone like Obama. But still, for his moment, he was extremely charismatic. Extremely. The people loved him. Yeah,
I mean, you talk about the crowds, tens, thousands, and sometimes tens of thousands of people, which again was reminiscent of the current era with Obama and, in fact, Hillary Clinton, but Obama particularly, this notion of the charismatic leader.
Yes, absolutely. He was, in a way, the president who sort of invents that on a mass level, because tens of thousands of people would show up. They went crazy over him. They wanted to touch him if possible, or any way to get close to him. And he was admired for his character, for his common man identification. He warred against, he challenged the Bank of the United States, and he
got into huge policy fights.
Yeah, huge policy fights, and he was very, very bold in attacking moneyed institutions on behalf of the common individual.
Oh, yeah. Are there such people on the scene today?
Well, I don't know. 3 guesses. Yeah, okay. 3 guesses.
Rate Jackson. I mean, we talk about this parlor game of rating presidents.
Yeah.
How does he rate? Not necessarily in numbers, but in terms of as a president and as a presidency.
Yeah. I would say as a presidency, he certainly rates definitely in the top 10, absolutely, because he really changes the nature of the presidency. He's the first one who extensively uses the veto power. He changes the sense of the power of the presidency, and to me, he represents 2 main things. Walt Whitman once says, in America, there are 2 great things. There's the capacity for individual expression, and the capacity for identifying with other people, for a sense of equality with other people, those 2 things. And Andrew Jackson, above all, represents those 2 simultaneous things: individual power and self-reliance, at the same time a true, genuine identification with a common individual.
Interesting. Now, next book is Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Yeah.
You're stuck in that era.
Yeah.
What is it about Stowe that leads you to her? But a more general question is, how do you come to write these books? You wrote Walt Whitman. You wrote on John Brown. Now you've written Andrew. How does it happen?
Yeah. That's really funny. It's like an evolution. Either I come up with an idea in my mind, like the John Brown book or the Walt Whitman book, or as in the case of Waking Giant or the Harry Beecher Stowe book, a publisher approaches me and I say, that's a good idea, I'd like to do that.
And you do it.
And I just do it, yeah. So that's basically what happens. Other times a publisher might approach me and I don't like the idea. I said, no, I'd rather not do that. But
any books that haven't been written and won't be written by David Reynolds?
Someone approached me, a publisher approached me about doing a book on American utopias, utopian communities, which would be a great book.
Which you deal with in some way
yes,
here.
Absolutely. So, I'm thinking about that, but probably I won't do it. I don't know why. It's a huge project. It's a great project. But I might maybe suggest another writer to do that.
We talked about this earlier before we came on the set. 20th century figure that you'd like to do a biography or a cultural biography is who?
Yes, believe it or not, I was thinking of doing on Paul McCartney just because I think he's a powerful figure and a very creative figure. But McCartney's lawyers don't really want, and he himself doesn't want a biography to be done at this moment. And so I think I would not beat Sir Paul in court or something like that if I, my agent, Andrew Wiley, knows his lawyers and everything. And in a way, that project has been nixed. So, but I'm always rattling around ideas in my mind.
Yeah, and what that suggests, and certainly what this book and the previous book suggests, is the importance of popular culture in American society's politics and social and cultural relations. Popular culture, not high culture, popular culture.
Absolutely. And some of our greatest authors would acknowledge that. Herman Melville said great writers are parts of their times. And when he wrote Moby Dick, not many people know that there were all these novels before his about white whales and whales crashing into ships.
Well, the Essex. I recently read 2 books on that the sinking of the Essex by the whale.
Yeah, absolutely. And so he and Nathaniel Hawthorne were very much absorbing popular culture of their era and doing something new with it, doing something fresh with it, but still very much drawing energy from the popular writing that had gone on before them. So popular culture is very, very important. Absolutely.
So I want to know the impact of the Beatles, the Stones, Bob Dylan on American society and politics. You've got to write the book.
Yeah, all right. Well, maybe, yeah.
Okay.
It'd be fun.
One of the things that struck me as a political scientist and sort of a student of elections was when you look at the campaigning done in this era, it makes modern campaigning, when you talk about negative campaigning, it sounds like church socials. These people were vicious liars and character assassins. Yeah. I loved it, but...
Yeah, I know, of course. Well, for example, in the 1828 campaign, it was charged by Andrew Jackson's opponents that Jackson had been the son of a mulatto man and a common prostitute, and that his brother, Jackson's brother, supposedly was sold as a slave. This was a fabrication. It was a fabrication, but that was one of the charges. Also, it was charged by Jackson's supporters that John Quincy Adams, had served as a kind of pimp in Russia when he was diplomat in Russia. This was false as well, and had traded the sexual favors of a beautiful secretary for political favors from the Tsar of Russia. Wrong, but still, those were some of the stories that were going on back then.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. Another thing that struck me, again, that had sort of modern resonances was this is the era of manifest destiny.
Yes.
And there are clearly parallels, or not more than parallels. It's a continuum to the Bush Doctrine, for example, of American exceptionalism.
Yes.
Talk about sort of the city on the shining, or the shining city on the hill, and American exceptionalism. It's here.
Yes. It's very much still with us, and the idea of the phrase manifest destiny was coined in a Democratic magazine in 1845, just before the Mexican War, when we were spreading west and fighting Mexico and taking over California and Texas and New Mexico and all of those western territories. And it was the idea that God was behind us as a nation to spread democracy elsewhere in the West or even elsewhere throughout the world.
Wait a minute, this has got resonance.
Yeah, exactly, absolutely. Very much looking forward to the Bush Doctrine.
Now, is this a core element of the American political psychology, that we're, in a sense, you know, the secular Jews, we're God's chosen people, and we've got sort of this divine right and obligation to democratize the world?
It's been around since Puritan times, this shining city upon the hill for all the world to see. That's what John Winthrop said America was. He said that in 1630, and then Manifest Destiny reinforces that and makes it more aggressive in 1845 when that comes along. And then it leads to Teddy Roosevelt and then to the Bush Doctrine. So yeah, absolutely. It's part of the American psyche.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's step back to Jackson. If Jackson were around today, what might he advise the new president to do?
I think what he would advise the president to do, and I think Obama shows signs of doing this, would be to be self-reliant, to really believe in the idea of the buck stopping here, that he has to have his advisors. I mean, that's what, in a way, saved Andrew Jackson. I said that he chose some cronies. It's true. But ultimately, it was the buck stops here. I have the vision, and I am the one who really makes the final decision. So I believe that's what he would say. I hope, I think, that that's the direction that Obama's going in.
Well, at least with the appointment of, or the nomination rather, of Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, there seems to be that element of it there. And then,
yes,
I mean, people have used the metaphor from the book, Doris Kearns' book title, A Team of Rivals. But
yes.
I mean, in fact, that seems to be what Obama's doing.
I think so. He's being rather bold, I think, in choosing certain people that are not exactly of his particular stamp. And in one case, Hillary Clinton, someone who actually opposed him at one moment. I think that does remind me of the kind of team of rivals. I think that he can make it work through his charisma, through his force of personality, and that's exactly what Andrew Jackson would advise him to do.
Thank you. That was great. It went much too fast, but I thoroughly enjoyed the book. And when Harriet Beecher Stowe comes out, you're on.
Absolutely. I'd love to be here. It's great being on the show.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.tv. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.